Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
You can tell a lot about where a company is going by looking at where it's been. ConocoPhillips, Alaska's oil and gas company.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with your Alaska weather. As always, please visit our website, arh.noaa.gov, getting updates to the forecast there, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories we may have out. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391, and you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook. Starting us off, we'll take a look at our warnings for the area. Right now, we only have two up along the Arctic coast, much of the Beaufort Sea area. We do have a blizzard warning out for both of these areas, and that is going to extend from 9 p.m. tonight all the way through tomorrow and into 6 a.m. on Wednesday. So look out for that. For quite a long time that's going to be out there. Some pretty bad conditions with some snow, blowing snow, reducing those visibilities, so watch out along the coastline. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, starting us off over the Bering Sea side, we have our low pressure system, the main one for the area south of the Aleutians right now, bringing a lot of cloud cover out over the Bering Sea, extending up around the Pribilofs area. As we watch this, we have another low starting to make its way further to the north, going to be absorbed by this low, and that's going to keep that area just spinning there with the main low pressure just sitting right south of the Aleutians. As we move out over the mainland part of the state, not a whole lot of high clouds out over the Gulf. We are seeing some lower clouds though, and see that northwest flow with the colder air that we've been having throughout much of the state extending down into the Gulf. As you look up along the Arctic coastline, some more cloud cover up there, and that's with the low pressure further off to the north that's bringing in those conditions that will become blizzards as we get into later parts of tonight, 9 p.m. again for along the Beaufort Sea coastline there. Taking a look now for the remainder of the day, starting off in the southeast, not a whole lot in terms of precipitation, although there is this trough extending out into the Gulf, and a low will begin to form there as we get into the evening hours. Then as we move along into the south central, not going to see a whole lot until we get north of the Alaska Range, places out into the interior and further off to the east, going to see some isolated snow showers up there. That's going to extend up along the border of the state to around the Fort Yukon area, and then as we get along the Arctic coast, we're going to see snow throughout that whole area, starting to pick up. Not a whole lot of winds now, but those are expected to increase as we move later into the evening hours. Then along the western parts of the west coast, we are seeing some isolated snow showers extending from the Tin City area down into the Cape Newingham area, with some areas of fog around the YK Delta. Out over the Aleutian Islands, our low pressure is bringing some warmer air from the south, giving us some rain from the eastern Aleutians, extending into the central Aleutians as well, not quite making their way to the Pribilofs at this time. As we move into the evening hours, that's going to start to mix with some snow as we get further off to the east, extending that precip now into areas of the Alaska Peninsula, but still seeing that warm southerly flow, bringing a lot of rain to the areas as well, extending all the way to the western Aleutians now. As we move up the west coast of the state, that snow expanding inward from the Bristol Bay area, riding up all the way into the Seward Peninsula area, further inland to the McGrath area, into Galena area, and then up along the west coast to the Arctic coastline. And then we have our blowing snow way off to the east as those blizzard conditions come into effect. Down along the eastern parts of the interior from the Brooks Range all the way down through the Alaska Range, expecting to see snow throughout the night. Then in the south central, that's going to diminish, and right along the coastline, we are going to see not a whole lot in terms of precipitation throughout the southeast. However, the low that is forming out in the Gulf, going to start to see the precipitation moving closer, not quite going to make it there over the nighttime hours. But then as we move into Tuesday, some of the snow is going to make it to the southern parts of the Panhandle and some places near Yakutat as well. South Central is still going to be void of precip until we get up into the Alaska range. We are going to see some snow showers up there, extending up through the interior, up along the Arctic coastline once again. The blizzard conditions out east, some blowing snow, not quite so bad to be blizzard conditions out to the west near the Barrow area, but still going to be a reduction of visibility with the stronger winds and the snowfall out there. Then along the west coast, snow showers all the way down the coastline and into the interior locations as well, stretching up north of Galena down into areas in the Bristol Bay area. Our low pressure continuing to sit to the south of the Aleutian Islands, with the warmer air bringing rain throughout the central Aleutians to the western Aleutians, mixing with snow as we get further to the east, becoming snow as we get to areas around Cold Bay and Nelson Lagoon. As we get into the Bering Sea, however, still a little bit warmer there for St. Paul and St. George, a mix of rain and snow for Tuesday. Taking us into Wednesday, that low finally starting to diminish and push off to the east. We are going to see a mixture of rain and snow throughout the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula. A little bit colder now for the Pribilofs, going to see some snow out there. As we move into places in Bristol Bay, going to see snow extending from Kodiak Island up into areas of the YK Delta. And as we get further to the north, Seward Peninsula on the eastern side going to be a little bit drier, but out west towards St. Lawrence Island, going to see snow extending all the way up through Point Hope and then up along the Arctic coast, where we will see a continuance of the blowing snow conditions out west, and the blizzard conditions will drop off about 6 a.m. on Wednesday, but we will still see some snow throughout much of the day. As we move down into places near Fort Yukon and further to the east, going to see some snow showers out there and some light snow showers for places in the interior extending down to the Alaska range. Not a whole lot though, because we have the high pressure that's kind of dominating that area. Down in the south central, diminished precipitation there as well. But as we move to the southeastern part of the state, a rain and snow mix throughout much of the area, with a lot of rain further to the south, Ketchikan, mixing and becoming snow as we get further to the north for Juneau and Skagway. And that will extend also throughout to Yakutat. Taking a look at our temperatures for the southeast, warmer to the south, 26 degrees for Ketchikan this afternoon, dropping all the way down to 14 degrees near Haines, and other temperatures ranging in the middle, anywhere from 17 to Juneau, down into those mid-20s further to the south again. As we move into the south central, colder temperatures inland down to as low as -12 for Golcana, single digits for other locations until we get further towards the water, going to get up into the teens there, and then along the Gulf Coast, temperatures getting up into the lower 20s, and Kodiak Island a little bit warmer, still at 30 degrees. Taking us into the interior part of the state, right around zero for places in the south. As we get further to the north, temperatures dropping down below zero, -15 for Arctic Village. Eagle a little bit warmer, -6 there. Bettles -12, and then as we get up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures out east a little bit colder. Nuiqsut down to -20 degrees, Deadhorse -12, but we're getting into the single digits further off to the west. Taking us down the west coast of the state in the Kotzebue Sound area, primarily in the teens, a little bit colder as we get further inland. We are going to see 4 at Kotzebue itself. As we drop down to the Nelson Lagoon side, or not Lagoon, south of the Seward Peninsula, there we have temperatures in the teens for the majority of locations, 15 for Galena. Taking us down to the southwest part of the state, then we have in the YK Delta temperatures in the upper teens there for Antioch, 19 degrees, into the mid-20s as we get along the coastline, then into the mid-teens as we get back to further inland locations. Iliamna 18 degrees, up around 20 degrees for the Bristol Bay area, extending into the Alaska Peninsula, and that's going to take us up into the 30s as we get closer to Cold Bay at 34 degrees. As we move off to the west, our warmest right now at 45 degrees, in the lower 40s as we get out to the western Aleutian Islands, and then for the Pribilofs in the mid-30s. Taking a look now at our low temperatures, staying out in the Aleutian Islands. Only going to be right around that 40-degree mark. Not a whole lot of change with the southerly flow around that low pressure. However, as we get to the southwest part of the state, dropping down into the single digits, down to 5 degrees for king salmon. A little bit warmer along the coastline. Macoriac only dropping down to 22 degrees tonight. Up towards the Seward Peninsula, single digits for most locations, 2 degrees for Nome expected low. Shishmaref a little bit warmer, 10 degrees expected low there, but Kotzebue down to -3. Up along the Arctic coast, expecting all locations to get down below zero, with Deadhorse dropping down to -11. Then throughout the Brooks Range, extending down to parts of the eastern interior, all temperatures expected to get below zero tonight. And as we get down into the south central, we do have temperatures down to as low as -24 for Golconda. Down at Kenai, -4. Seward, right on the other side of the peninsula, getting down to 1 degree tonight. Kodiak only getting down to 22 degrees tonight, a little bit warmer there. And then down in the southeast, -5 for Haines. That's going to be the coldest, only getting down to 24 degrees for Ketchikan. As we take a look at our highs for tomorrow, getting up into the upper 20s for the southern parts of the Panhandle, only getting up to around 0 for the Haines-Skagway area. As we move into the south central, single digits for most locations in the interior with the exception of Golconda, only getting up to -7 tomorrow. And then as we get further along the coastline, temperatures getting up into the teens for most locations. In the interior, going to stay pretty cold, below 0 for most locations, a little bit warmer actually along the Arctic coast, with Barter Island getting up to 0 degrees tomorrow. And as we get into the Kotzebue Sound area, we're going to see temperatures colder in the interior locations, -1 for Kotzebue, warmer as we get into the west, into the teens there. Seward Peninsula area, going to see temperatures in the teens for the majority of locations. And as we drop down to the YK Delta, going to see temperatures in the east in the teens, getting up to around 30 as we get further off to the west. Bristol Bay area, right around 20 degrees for most locations. And that'll take us into the eastern Aleutian Islands, 43 degrees for Dutch Harbor, the upper 30s for the Alaska Peninsula. And then as we look out way to the west, Shemya getting up to 42 degrees for a high tomorrow. That'll take us into our aviation forecast. A lot of lower clouds throughout the Bering Sea, going to bring some widespread MVFR conditions with some occasional IFR along the southwest coastline extending up towards St. Lawrence Island. And then as we go along the Aleutian Islands, some IFR conditions with that low bringing in the moisture from the south. Up along the Arctic coast, going to have MVFR conditions all along there with that snow, and some IFR conditions with those blizzard conditions off to the east. Some MVFR conditions extending into places of the eastern interior. Not a whole lot for the south central, but as we get with our new low pressure tomorrow, going to bring in some moisture right along the Gulf coastline to the southeast. Some MVFR conditions expected there. Taking a look at our passes, Anaktuvuk should start off MVFR tomorrow, but then become VFR as we move throughout the day. Same is true for Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both be VFR throughout the day tomorrow. Rainy Pass is also expected to be VFR for tomorrow. And then Windy Pass should be MVFR all throughout the day. Isabel Pass is going to be the same with that MVFR conditions throughout the day tomorrow. Mentasta Pass also expected to be MVFR, as well as Tanita Pass. And Portage will also be MVFR throughout the day tomorrow. Chilkoot and White will both start off VFR, but then drop down later in the evening hours to MVFR conditions. Taking a look at our freezing level, to the south of the southeast part of the state, riding into the Gulf, and then to the Alaska Peninsula, extending over the Pribilofs, and then out to the north and west. We have some warmer air coming in from the south with that low pressure system that we can see extending up over the central Aleutian Islands. Looking at our icing for tomorrow, we have an area of icing extending just near the western Aleutians all the way out towards the Alaska Peninsula, and that's going to be light between 7,000 and 10,000 feet. Another area of light icing along the southwest coastline, eastern Bering Sea, between 2,000 and 7,000 feet. And then way off to the east on the edge of the southeast part of the state, between 1,000 and 5,000 feet, some light icing expected there as well. Jet stream for tomorrow, the majority of it not over mainland Alaska, further to the south, but we do have a branch of the jet going right along the southwest coast, 75 knots, getting up to as high as 90 knots in the Gulf, then exiting off a little bit higher, 110 knots, and that'll be south of the Panhandle. As we look further off to the west, strongest portion of the jet well to the south of the Aleutian Islands, 140 knots there on the southern side of our low, and that's going to drop down to 110 knots as it moves off to the south and east. Taking us down to 9,000 feet, we have our flow coming in off of Russia up to 15 to 20 knots coming into our low. We're going to have circulation around that low getting up to as high as 40 knots there. Much of the rest of the Bering Sea pretty light at 15 knots. However, over the mainland part of the state, northerly flow is dominant, getting up to as high as 35 knots coming into the Cook Inlet, Barren Islands area, and that's going to move around the low, picking up to 40 knots as we get closer towards the Panhandle. out over the eastern parts of the state, dropping us down to around 10 knots, but still out of a northerly direction. Taking us down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow pattern. Once again, weaker out to the east, 10 knots there, getting up to as high as 30 knots along the coastline, bringing some light chop around that area. Coming into the Gulf, about 25 knots, going to see a little bit of turbulence associated with that as we move over the Panhandle. And then way out to the west, we have flow around our low pressure, getting as high as 40 knots there. Going to see some light turbulence with that as well, extending out towards the Alaska Peninsula. Other flow out over the Bering Sea, not too high, 10 to 15 knots there. Taking a look at our turbulence now, we have that area extending from the Alaska Peninsula all the way out towards the western Aleutian Islands below 4,000 feet, pretty light. Then we have some light from Barrow all the way down into the Seward Peninsula below 4,000 feet. And then way off in the southeast below 5,000 feet there, just a little area right along the Gulf Coast side of the southeast. And if you stay with us, we'll be back shortly with your marine forecast.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ed Cornfield. On behalf of the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation and Alaska Public Media, welcome to another edition of Hangar Flying. This evening, my guest is Mike Hunt. Mike joined us on the show before. Mike was a pilot during World War II and flew the Lend-Lease routes up through Alaska and has been involved in aviation for over 75 years. Welcome to Hangar Flying, Mike.
Thank you, Ed.
So let's just briefly talk about your background in during World War II and the Lend-Lease program. Basically, what did you do?
Yeah, well, my main job was flying B-17s out of Boeing Field. And I got introduced to Lend-Lease because they'd get behind in their deliveries to the Russians at Ladd Field Fairbanks. And so they'd say, well, you four-engine pilots can fly these single-engine airplanes. And they said, we'll show you how to start the engine on a P-39, and then all you got to do is follow that B-25 out there on the ramp. Sounds real simple. And, of course, we're 20-year-old kids, and we can do anything. Nothing can stop us, so that's what they did. They showed us how to start the engine, and I followed this B-25 out. 5 of us were behind him. In about 40 minutes in the flight, why, my engine suddenly quit. And I do remember him saying, if the engine quits, pull the door and bail out. We can always get another door, but it takes a while to train a pilot. But I looked down at those snow-covered peaks and said, that's not a good option to bail out. And riding the airplane down was a worse option. So I did what every prudent pilot does. He changed his fuel source, put on the boost pump. The engine came back to life, and I caught up with my B-25 and delivered to Ladd Field a few days later.
Oh, that's a good story. I've got a picture that's kind of come up on the screen, and maybe you can just describe that picture.
Well, that is Army Air Corps Primary Flying School at Visalia, California. And I hadn't been there very long, and I got to put the goggles on my helmet. When you first get there, you got to wear your goggles around your neck because you're a dodo. That means a bird that tries to fly but doesn't have wings. And this subject me to a lot of harassment because the upper class sees this underclassman wearing goggles, and some of these guys haven't soloed yet. So right away, after 2 hours, my instructor put me with the flight commander, who was a gruff old guy, and on takeoff, he stabbed the rudder with his foot and he said, you're skidding. And pretty soon he knocked the stick out of my hand and he says, you're slipping. I just let go of the airplane. Of course, I can't talk back, and then he, on the gosport, he says, aren't you flying this thing? And I said, no, you are. And I figured, well, he put me through the ringer then. He gave me everything that I'd learned in secondary CPT at college. And I figured, boy, I've washed out because I insulted the flight commander. But I don't treat an airplane roughly. I treat it smoothly like I would a beautiful lady. And after we landed, he told my instructor he's okay to solo. So that subject me to a lot more harassment because here is a kid that just arrived there, got a couple of hours flying time, and he's wearing these goggles on his helmet. So the upperclassmen really jumped on me then, and I was cocky, I'll have to say that. But
So now you formed pretty special relationships in the military, especially during World War II. And I've got another picture coming up that maybe you can tell us about that. And this is one of your oldest friends, I think.
Well, that's my dear friend Duncan Miller. I call him Colonel Duncan Miller. We were formers of our non-skid airline, and we're the only survivors right now. And I'm probably the only one that can tell the story because he's got Alzheimer's. Although he remembers what we did 65 years ago, he can't tell me what we talked about 5 minutes ago. But he's a dear friend, and I figure that I'm a survivor because he's a real religious man. And he does the Lord's work now, food banks, anything to help somebody. And the Lord had to save him to do the Lord's work. And I just happened to be with him on some of these escapades. And yes, he's a very dear friend.
Oh, well, good. Oh, good. We're going to start on another subject, but we'll probably have to interrupt that and get you back again next time. But you've been pretty busy lately, and you actually took a trip to Washington, D.C. Can you, about 30 seconds, give us a little bit of a rundown of what that was for?
Well, I was on the honor flight to see the memorials in Washington, D.C., and you realize that freedom isn't free until you see all those graves where women and men gave it all. I mean, and that's the reason we enjoy our freedom today, is because of all the sacrifices that these soldiers did ahead of us. And we're fortunate to be survivors, and I appreciate what they did, and it's an awesome trip.
Mm-hmm. Mike, we're out of time, but we're going to continue the story in the next session, and I want you to come back and visit with us again. And folks, thanks for watching, and fly safe.
Welcome back. We'll start the marine forecast off in the southeast part of the state. A mixture of flows. We have out in the southwesterly flow getting up to as high as 30 knots. As we get further to the north, flow switches to become easterly about 30 knots as well. Inside waters down south out of the southeast 20 knots, becoming northerly as we get further to the north, 30 knots there with some freezing spray expected with those strong northerly winds. Seas in the inside waters only up to about 7 feet. Out in the Gulf, we're going to see seas getting up to as high as 12 feet there. Then into Wednesday, we have our flow in the inside waters southeasterly 15 to 20 knots, still out of the north 30 knots as we get further to the north. Then out over the Gulf, primarily out of a westerly direction around 20 knots as we get further to the north around the Yakutat area, still out of the east about 25 knots there. Seas getting up to as high as 11 feet, highest in the south. Over the south central, primary flow out of a northwesterly direction, a little bit more northerly as we get further towards the Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet areas. 20 to 25 knots out in the Gulf, 15 knots for areas in the Cook Inlet area, getting as high as 25 as we get closer to the Barrens. We are going to have freezing spray throughout all of these areas out west, to include all the areas as we get into the Gulf as well. A lot of freezing spray there, higher gusts in the Prince William Sound areas and further off towards Cordova. We are going to have some heavy freezing spray in the Prince William Sound area, especially in the north, and then near the Barren Islands as well. Some heavy freezing spray expected for tomorrow. As we move into Wednesday, flow primarily out of a northeasterly direction, lower towards northern Cook Inlet, 10 knots there, getting up into around 20 for most locations. South of Kodiak, a little bit higher, 25 knots there. Seas not very high, 4 to 7 feet out in the Gulf, a little bit lower as we get closer to Cook Inlet down to Shelikof Strait, 3 to 5 feet there. As we take a look now in the Alaska Peninsula, we have flow out of an easterly direction, 20 to 25 knots, and that's going to become more northwesterly and variable as we get closer to the Bristol Bay area, down to 10 knots there. Seas only around 2 to 6 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Some freezing spray, however, with a northwesterly flow along the coastline, further off towards Kodiak Island and places along the Alaska Peninsula. Then into Wednesday, flow going to be primarily out of an easterly direction, picking up quite a bit up to as high as 35 knots, with seas getting up to as high as 11 feet, highest on the Pacific side again. Then as we move out over the Aleutian Islands, starting off west-northeasterly flow, 30 knots there, getting up to as high as 35 knots near the central Aleutian Islands, dropping down to around 25 knots further to the east. Taking a look into Wednesday, flow becoming northeasterly, 35 to 40 knots there, dropping down out west out of the east at 15 knots near Shemiam. Then as we take a look out over the west coast of the state, out of the northeast, some freezing spray up there, 20 knots closer to Tin City area. Then as we get down further to the south, dropping down to 15 knots, but still expecting some freezing spray there. Then out of the east, further to the south, 15 knots. And then as we move into Wednesday, flow primarily out of an east or northeasterly direction, getting as high as 30 knots south of Macoriac, and then a little bit lower, 25 knots as we get closer towards Gamble. Up along the Arctic coastline, we have flow way out west out of a northeasterly direction up to as high as 20 knots there. Freezing spray in the ice-free areas. However, as we get further to the east and Barrow further off out of the westerly direction, getting up to as high as 35 knots, but ice underneath that. As we move into Wednesday, that flow dropping off a little bit, becoming more northwesterly up to as high as 30 knots, dropping down to 20 as we get closer towards Barrow. Then out of a northeasterly direction, 15 to 20 knots, and that's going to have some freezing spray still in those ice-free areas. Taking a now quick recap over the state, low pressure south of the Aleutian Islands, bringing in some rain and warmer air from the south, mixing with snow as we get closer to the Alaska Peninsula. Then up all the way along the west coast, going to see snow extending all the way up towards the Barrow area. And then further off to the east, we are expecting some blizzard conditions to develop tonight around 9 p.m. Some stronger winds mixing in with that snow, diminishing those visibilities all the way down to a quarter mile or less. Then we have snow throughout much of the interior until we get to the Alaska Range where that starts to diminish. Not a whole lot of activity for the south central. That is going to extend down into the southeast with a new low pressure forming over tonight, starting to bring some precip closer to the Panhandle. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for staying with us tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.